Okay, thank you for your patience. I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is Kesha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our Monday strategic overview and discussion for March 6, 2023. And I'll be joined in discussion today by Bruce Director. And we're going to sort of take up the question of the quantum leap that President Trump, former President Donald Trump, just put the nation on the course toward as he is outlining his message and his plans and campaign, and not just the campaign, but the direction that the country will be going in under his leadership when he takes the presidency back in 2025, after the presidential elections in 2024. And what we're going to discuss is, at this time, this idea of what President Trump has put forth around launching an ultimate flank against the globalists, against what we would say the Bushies, the globalists, the whole World Economic Forum, and their policies to depopulate, their policies for population reduction and economic collapse and decline. And what President Trump initiated over the course of the weekend, where he developed his platform, and also in a recent message that he gave, a 3-minute and 55-second message on his Agenda 47 meeting or message, that he addressed the question of what I actually responded to in an article that I did, which I will put up in the chat very soon. But in response to what President Trump had to say, and we'll go through this today, and the very important implications of this in terms of the decades-long work that LaRouchePAC, under the leadership of the great visionary Lyndon LaRouche, has been committed to. And the article that I wrote is titled "Donald Trump's Bold Challenge: The Future Belongs to the Beautiful City Builders." And we'll go through that. This is a question of, what does it actually take to build out beautiful cities? What is this classical American tradition, going back to the traditions of the classical Greek, classical Italian traditions in architecture, in building beautiful structures? And we'll go through what has to be understood on the question of the scientific method and economic approach that Lyndon LaRouche understood. And this is where Trump is very much, in his own way, echoing those ideas. And so we're going to be discussing what an actual quantum leap in revolutionizing and improving the standards of living of the population. And so when President Trump, in his Agenda 47 message, called for a competition for proposals for 10 cities in city building and building beautiful cities, and he called for the tearing down of these ugly buildings and ugly cities and going with classical architecture. This is something that Lyndon LaRouche really developed the concept around from the standpoint of, and Bruce will go into this a little bit more in terms of the scientific method around the relationship of beautiful cities to a Keplerian approach, the harmonic orderings of the solar system, and also from the standpoint of how you organize your cities, particularly around the development of a productive labor force. I think that's very important for us to think about, and that's what President Trump was discussing. How are we going to get this productive labor force? Well, first of all, we have to have an increase in the birth rate of the population. And you will notice, if you didn't hear the speech, and also how he echoed this and developed it in his speech and message to CPAC, where he just spoke this past weekend, laying out this very beautiful idea of progress for the nation, but saying, he called for needing a baby boom, a new baby boom. Well, we've seen, and there's charts and reports put out that we have seen a rapid decline in the rate of birth rate in America, and really in many nations around the world. In the United States, there's been a rapid decline, especially since 2007 to 2009. And you've seen this because of the rate of inflation. And what's being shown is that people are not, it's not the case that women and young people don't want to have families. The question is, what is happening to the state of our economy? And so the question of how do you actually build the physical economy, and we've discussed this a bit before, how do we actually address the need for having a one income earner household, which there's no way that we have that currently under the Biden regime, and really through the economic policies that have been in place for the last several decades. We've seen a rapid rate of decline. So we're going to be discussing and calling on some of our colleagues and those who are participating with us in these discussions. We want to hear your thoughts and proposals, and we're going to be also putting together where LaRouchePAC can take a leading stand on producing material and producing outlines for how we actually build these beautiful cities. The president was talking about President Trump. I don't call the other guy president, but anyway, was talking about the federal public lands and that can be used for the development of these beautiful cities. So we're going to discuss that more. I will post up the article that I did in response to President Trump's call for quantum leaps in the standard of living of the population. And we'll also have a discussion on some of the 50-odd years of work that we've been doing in discussing the concept of building beautiful cities, both on Earth, and that has to evolve even into our humanity's reaches into space. And this was something very developed that LaRouche developed around the concept of a Mars colonization plan and building beautiful cities in the context of a Mars colonization. So why don't I turn it over to Bruce now so we can get deeper into the discussion, and then I will invite you all to come and bring your questions and comments.
Thanks a lot, Kesha. First, let me apologize. I'm recovering from a cold, so I have a bit of a cough, and I hope it's not too annoying, but I'll try and suppress it as much as I can. First of all, let me say that it was quite happy to see President Trump's message on Friday, but it was not a surprise because President Trump, as a builder, has always been an advocate of development, large-scale building projects, but not just any building projects. I'll remind you of the speech that Trump gave in Davos in February 2020, right before the pandemic arrived in the United States, the coronavirus pandemic. And Kesha quoted from his speech there, in which he basically criticized the Europeans and the globalists and the people who run Davos for being nothing but a bunch of anti-human pessimists. He didn't use those words, but he might as well have. And he compared their pessimism with the great cathedral builders and city builders of the Renaissance. He particularly singled out the Dome in Florence and the other cathedrals. And the Dome in Florence, of course, was a major scientific breakthrough that had a dramatic development, both in terms of engineering and physical science, but also in terms of cultural development and psychological and cultural development of mankind, which radiated long after the building of it. And really, as I think we've made clear in some of the lectures that Bob Ingram has done and some of the other articles we printed, really sort of established the foundation of what ultimately became the United States of America. And Trump basically criticized the Davos elite by saying, you know, America under my presidency has gone back to this idea, while you remain stuck in the pessimism of globalism, despair, negative ideas such as climate change and zero growth. Now, he also issued in the last year of his presidency a executive order that all federal buildings should be built according to the classical style. If you see some of the monstrosities that have been built, like the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., which houses the headquarters of the FBI, or some of these other Nazi-like, Mussolini-like, Soviet-style architecture, which is used for government buildings today, it's exactly the opposite. And Trump appointed some experts to the architects to the Fine Arts Commission and ordered that this be adopted in the design of all federal buildings. Some of the federal buildings you see that were built during the Roosevelt era or before are more in the classical style and much more inviting to the city around them. And they say something different about what the purpose of government is. And so the architecture is not just a secondary thing or a matter of aesthetics, but it conveys what the purpose of the government is, whether it's the government for, by, and of the people, or whether it's some big behemoth monstrosity which is there to control the people. And these kinds of things are extremely important, as we see from examples in the Renaissance and so forth. Our cities in the United States and in most around the world have become increasingly anti-human, both in their architecture, in their sprawl, in their cookie cutterness, in their hostility towards facilitating human economic development. So the call for building of 10 new cities, which I should say Lyndon LaRouche called for more than 50 years ago, is quite welcome. Now, this raises a couple of questions that are very important to begin as a prelude to getting into what LaRouche's proposals were, which is that the United States is not going to fix its current crisis, and I'm talking about its economic crisis and so forth, by going back to the past. A lot of people talk about how we have to reshore our industries. We need to go back to how things once were. That's not going to work. The way you get out of a crisis is you leap ahead. And Trump's use of the term quantum leap, revolutionizing the American standard of living, is precisely the idea we have to have. The development in Florence is very important. Remember that this construction of the Florentine Dome, it was the largest church ever built, but it didn't have a top to it. And construction was halted because of the Black Plague, which was a pandemic that killed off, much more serious than anything like the coronavirus, and killed off huge portions of the European population. I think about 40% or 50% of the Florentine population perished as a result. So it was a tremendous step back from the economic and cultural conditions that Florence had been in just a few years before. And but instead of going back to what once was, which is really not feasible, there needed to be a quantum leap, which we would call it now, a complete shift in the thinking. And that was facilitated by basically one guy, Filippo Brunelleschi, but there were others because Florence was a sort of a center of intellectualism and great craftsmen. And although, it wasn't a great paradise, there was a lot of corruption, there was a lot of bad things that can go on, but I'm not going to diverge into a history of Florence. We can do that some other time. But nevertheless, because of the perseverance and creativity of Brunelleschi and his close collaborators, he was able to design a plan and implement a plan, execute it, to build the largest dome that had ever been built, that was both beautiful from the inside and the outside, which, as I said, had a twofold effect. One is it demonstrated a new superior engineering technology and many design of machines and all kinds of other technologies that had to be developed in order to construct the dome. And then you also had a complete cultural shift because he created something beautiful. So it had the effect of radiating out a spiritual idea of the power of the human mind when employed in the image of God. That's what we need to do today. Now, there's a lot of talk right now about the bad things that are going on in our country and in our society. We hear a lot of complaints about the collapse of our education system, much justified. We hear a lot of complaints about the increasing weakness or decreasing strength of the American economy from the standpoint of a manufacturing and a technological capabilities. In fact, there was a study put out by the Australian Center for Strategic Studies just last week, which compared the US and China and some other nations on key 44 areas of advanced technology, such as nanoscale materials, coatings, advanced composite materials, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, rocket engines, jet engines, and so on and so forth. And according to their study, which may or may not be accurate, I'm not vouching for the accuracy of their study, but according to their study, China is ahead of the United States in 37 of the 44 areas. Now, there's a lot of talk in the political sphere right now about how we have to get China. We have to keep China down. And while it's true that perhaps if this thing is accurate, that some of China's advancement in this area has been due to nefarious activities, both on the part of China and, most importantly, on the part of globalist elites, including people in the United States, who turn their back on the development of the country. Nevertheless, that's not really the problem. The point is that when you're dealing with questions of physical science, biology, human development, these are not limited to any one country. These are laws of nature. These are the principles which govern, which are God-given principles, and they're free for anybody to discover. And throughout history, there's never been it's never been effective to try and stop the advancement of science wherever it occurs. Instead, one has to adopt a policy, and the United States did this repeatedly, a policy of scientific advancement that has to be the principal basis of organization of society and of the economy. The government has a role to play, but in the United States, and clearly I think a superior system, is a limited role, but not a free trade role, not a free enterprise role, but one based on the American system as it was developed from our beginning by Alexander Hamilton and the subsequent people who developed that concept through the National Bank, the manufacturers, Lincoln's policy, and I think Bob Ingram has talked about this quite a bit, and so has Brian Lance, who's produced some very good videos and some long, detailed reports on how this works in the United States. But I'll point out, for example, going back to the 50s and 60s and 70s period between the United States and the Soviet Union, which were the only two nuclear powers at that time. And, you know, the Soviet Union, which had an inferior system, both economically and politically, given that it was a communist system that was also governed by some very strange and anti-human ideas, in my opinion. The Soviets, nevertheless, basically because of the Russian tradition of science, which goes all the way back to Peter the Great and Leibniz's founding of the Russian Academy of Sciences. There was a long tradition in Russia of scientific development. And as Bob Ingram reported 2 weeks ago, of collaboration between Germany and Russia, in particular, on science and engineering and technological development. Well, the Soviets beat the United States to the hydrogen bomb. They beat the United States to the first satellite in space. They beat the United States to the first man in orbit. And the design of rocket engines that the Soviets came up with is actually superior to the one that the United States was using up to that point. And the design basically of Soviet rocket, the Soviet design of rocket engines is still the one that's being used today, including by SpaceX, with many modifications and improvements. So, the effort to try and win the Cold War, so to speak, by suppressing science in the United States, and this was criticized by Edward Teller and many scientists, was a fool's errand. The key was that Kennedy launched the Apollo project, and LaRouche, along with Reagan and other people around the Reagan administration, including some people in the military establishment before Reagan, pushed to develop the Strategic Defense Initiative and other interesting technologies, frontier technologies. That's what we need to do today. And Trump distinguished himself as being the only political figure, certainly the only one running for president in this period. But also, I think the only real political figure who has distinguished himself by adopting this kind of idea, which I don't mean to imply that he just adopted recently. I think it's in his thinking. And that's very, very important. And I would just say at this point that I think it's really important that we make this point in our organizing and our discussions with people, that they recognize this quality of Trump, which is the key promising one as to why he needs to be put back in the White House. Because if you do not have somebody in the White House who will push this idea, this direction, there's no way the United States is gonna get out of this crisis. You can't do it by trying to tinker here and tinker there in some way as to return to a precondition which doesn't exist anymore. You have to go, as Trump said, in a quantum leap. Now, that of course involves many things, such as the development of fusion energy. Trump proposed the Artemis program to go back to the moon and Mars, which is very important because that's a real science driver program. There are also many other areas which we could mention, you know, advances in biotechnology and so on and so forth. But what I want to focus on really is the concept here. that's embodied by his proposal on the construction excuse me, of 10 new cities. He called them freedom cities, which is a pretty good name. Now, I want to start this part of my discussion by just pointing out that this is something LaRouche has been talking about all along. I remember hearing LaRouche in the 1970s giving many lectures about the need to build new cities. And he would go into great detail about starting with digging a big hole, he would sometimes say. And even one time proposed using peaceful uses of nuclear weapons to do the initial excavation. And then he talked about, very specifics about how to design these cities, both in the United States, in advanced countries, in developing countries, where the cities were basically just massive sprawls caused by people coming in to the from the countryside. Just a second, I guess, just take a sip of water here. And LaRouche also proposed looking at it in a very unique way, which was from the standpoint of Mars. As I know most of you know, LaRouche proposed back in the early 80s and made it a feature of his presidential campaign in 1988, a Mars colonization program. Now, he was ridiculed for this, and it's quite gratifying that after 40 years, President Trump has got the United States at least going in this direction. And I think he was able to sufficiently implant the idea that Biden wasn't able to shut it down, although he hasn't been very helpful to it. But LaRouche wrote a paper in 1987 called The Construction of Cities, Building Cities in the Age of Mars Colonization. And in this, he talked about how if we begin to design how we would construct an actual city on Mars, this would open up the ideas about how you would actually apply these same principles on Earth. Now, obviously, in 1987, there were a lot of things that are available today which were not available then. We didn't have fiber optic communication. We didn't have miniaturized computer chips like we have now. We didn't have the potential for automation that we have. So we have a lot of advantages, and a lot of things can be done that weren't available to LaRouche's at the time of his original proposal. But I want to focus on the principles, and I'll be specific about that. But let me just show you first. Here's a page from the pamphlet, the article that he wrote. This is an artist's conception of how a city would be built on Mars. And each one of those, there's a central module, which is the city center. And then you see those other modules around. Each one could house up to 50,000 people. And he also said, if you look here, that you would build this according to a principle of least action, in which you would have a spherical construction, half of which would be below ground, which would have the transportation, storage, utilities, and so forth. And above ground, you would have passenger rapid transit and so forth. And the basis for designing the city was based on maximizing human creative potential. So let me read a few things from this that just gives you an idea. First of all, here's a subhead he had in this article. It says, cities as negentropy machines. Successful economic processes belong to the class of negentropic processes. On first examination, oh, there we go. Kesha put it up. On first examination of its physical characteristics, a successful economic process is typified by a continuous process of increase of the combined quality and quantity of the standard market basket of physical goods consumed per capita. This presumes a corresponding increase of output by the operatives producing these physical goods. It presumes technological progress causing such increases of the productive powers of labor. And he talks about populations, building the populations. The labor force is defined as a function of the total population of labor force age. Of this, initially on Earth, about half should be employed as operatives employed in production household goods, producer goods, or development, maintenance and operation and basic economic infrastructure, transportation, water management, communications, production and distribution of energy supplies. About 1/10 or more are employed as scientists, engineers, in direct management of production as such, medical professionals, or in teaching of the young. Unemployed members of the labor force and persons in other occupations combined are kept within the limit of less than 40%. So he elaborates the development of that. As technological advances, the average school leaving age rises in the direction of equivalence to a terminal degree in physical sciences. As the working day is shortened, the leisure so generated is consumed largely in adult education. This is aimed significantly to upgrading the technological capabilities. He says the city must be beautiful. A general requirement must be that wherever each function of human activity is to be served, the form of design employed shall be the principle of harmonic ordering congruent with the golden section. This includes the proportions of rooms, the relative scales of the rooms of a dwelling place, the relations of windows to room sizes, and everything else blended into a harmonic unity. Here, the architect must become at once a composer of classical polyphony, a painter with the informed eye of a Leonardo, a Raphael, a Rembrandt, and a physician in the spirit of Kepler. Such harmonic composition will coincide with the optimal agreement with the physiology of human least action. It will provide the optimal acoustics, the optimal distribution of light, of air movement, and so forth. The physiological requirements so addressed are consistent with the psychological ones. All architecture is a machine for use by human beings. It must agree with the requirement of the whole human being. The wholeness is expressed by human activity in its wholeness. All human activity is activity directed by the self-developmental characteristics peculiar to the human mind. As I have shown, as a matter of principles, both the physiology of individual mean-free pathway least action and the characteristic human creative mental activity are forms harmonic with the golden section. And he goes on to express more about his designs. Now, around the same time, LaRouche wrote another paper, or he had a footnote here, a Leibnizian approach to city design. And he has a subsection called, "The city is a cultural center. The core of the new city must be an educational complex. On all other points, our purpose here is to outline a sufficient number of the principal considerations to be included in city design so that the general conception of the design problem is communicated. The very center of the city, at least the functional center of the city, must be a complex of pedagogical museums, libraries, and cultural centers associated with the activities of those museums and libraries. All urban life should be organized around this complex of museums, associated parks, and teaching and research institutions. Naturally, this should include the leading medical service research centers of the entire region." He talks about the various principles of city design. The machine for the effective development is beautiful cities bounded by fertile fields of modern agriculture. Such cities are centers of culture and technology for all of the people, including most emphatically the families of the farmers, which share the city at the end of the day. And he talks about the development of these cities in the Renaissance and how we have to develop these cities according to these principles. So I think you can get the basic idea. He talks about housing. This is quite interesting to me, given how anti-human most housing is today. You know, and that's largely a financial decision because the banks and financiers of housing development don't want to take the risk of financing unique forms of housing, and instead they want cookie cutter designs. And that's why you see these housing developments being built everywhere, where every house looks exactly the same. I mean, you might be able to modify it a little bit by putting a deck on the back or a different kind of flooring, but the housing is all built according to a very financially least action design and not a human least action design, let alone the transportation from these housing developments into the areas where these people have to get to and work and so forth. He talks about we must desire the provision of apartment residences in multi-story buildings with elevators to provide the advantages of economy and population density. That is basic economy. The problem is to articulate such construction to the effect of providing light, greenery, and a sense of spaciousness at all levels of elevation. We are persuaded that this challenge can be solved economically by architects and associated scientists and engineers. We are also certain that the principles of Platonic ratios employed by the Gothic cathedrals builders and successfully mastered by the great Renaissance painters and other artists can and must be applied to the problems of combining function and psychological effect. So you get the idea. The idea is not to go back to the past, not to tinker with the present, but to do a quantum leap. And we are very fortunate, I think, to have had Lyndon LaRouche to elaborate many of the aspects of those designs of the quantum leap, and to have the opportunity today to get President Trump in there and see if we can get these finally implemented. So I think I'll stop there as my opening remarks, and let's see what else we can develop in the course of the discussion.